This is the box art for Animal Crossing, a simulation game released in 2002 on the GameCube where you play as a human just living their life after moving into a town full of various animals. I love this game's box art. It's a picture of your character leaving a house filled with several of the animal characters that can potentially be in your town. It's just a super cozy box art that fits the game's chill vibe. However, this cover art is for the European release of the game. The North American version of the game is basically the same thing, but one interesting difference is with this big message that lets you know that the game comes with a memory card included. In the European version, they made it so the memory card message is actually being spoken by the rabbit Gaston. I think it's a cute little fourth wall break that adds a tiny bit more charm. Animal Crossing is actually an updated version of the Japanese release of the game called Dobutsu no Mori Plus. Dobutsu no Mori Plus's box art is pretty nice too. It's your character on a boat with the boat captain, Cap'n, and the musician KK Slider playing his guitar next to a tree. I really dig the handwritten looking messages on the art too. It gives it a real down-to-earth feel. Dobutsu no Mori Plus is actually an updated version of another game, the original Dobutsu no Mori, released in 2001 on the Nintendo 64. The original Dobutsu no Mori's artwork is similar to Plus's artwork, but your character and Cap'n aren't there, it's just KK Slider. One really cool thing that this box art does is it has these little postage stamp designs in the top left of the box. One of them is even the Nintendo 64 logo, which is a really neat touch. Another neat touch is you can actually see the shadow of an animal on the box art. I think it might be Tom Nook's shadow, but it could just be a random bear or something. Whatever the case may be, it's cute. There was actually a fourth version of Dobutsu no Mori called Dobutsu no Mori E+, which was released on the GameCube after the Western version Animal Crossing. Dobutsu no Mori E+ was released in a bundle with the e-reader. This is what the cover art of the full bundle looks like. Nothing too crazy. What's more interesting is the box art for the cover of the actual game box. The box art is several of the game's villagers in these circles all over a white background. Most of the villagers are only shown in silhouette, but you can see some of them fully. I dig this one. This box art does a good job of emphasizing the sheer number of villagers that could possibly be in your town. The 6 characters featured on the box that aren't in silhouette are all new characters introduced in this version of the game too, which I think was a smart choice. While we're talking about Nintendo games, let's look at the box art for F-Zero, a futuristic racing game released as a launch title for the Super Nintendo in 1990. This cover art is for the North American release of the game that came out a year after the Japanese version. As you can see, the box art was significantly changed. The most obvious difference is the shape of the artwork as a whole. The Japanese version is done in a tall vertical format, while the American one is done in a wider horizontal format. The reason for this difference is honestly pretty simple. That's just because American and Japanese Super Nintendo boxes are different. Why they opted to change the style of the boxes when the Super Nintendo was released in the West, I don't know, but as a result, a ton of Super Nintendo games have vastly different artwork in Japan versus the West. The Japanese box art is done in a comic book inspired art style with a visible boom sound effect. You've got an action shot of the game's characters all racing, and you get clear pictures of all of their faces as well. Overall, this is a really fun box art. My only big issue is that the logo takes up far too much space. That's a good 40% of the artwork that this logo section takes up. I would have loved to get more of the actual racing scene. The North American box art also has a huge logo, but it's at least more dynamic since the logo is drawn with more depth, making it look like the logo is jumping out at you. The actual art of the race itself is fine enough. It's going for a less cartoony looking art style than the Japanese version, but I still think it's charming and it uses some nice colors. The next major game in the series was F-Zero X, released in 1998 on the Nintendo 64. The American artwork is pretty cool. It looks more three-dimensional now, which fits since F-Zero X is the series' proper leap into 3D. The background is motion blurred, which really helps sell the speed of the race going on. It's a good box art, but the only issue is that this box art is only half of the actual piece of artwork. Once we take a look at the Japanese version, we can see what the whole thing looks like. Above the racing machines are pictures of several of the game's racers, like Jody Summer, Mr. EAD, and Captain Falcon, who looks like he's about to go off on somebody. Look at how he's gritting his teeth. The tough, edgy, in-your-face style completely fits F-Zero, especially F-Zero X and its metal soundtrack. The next game in the series was F-Zero Maximum Velocity, released on the Game Boy Advance in 2001, making this the first portable entry in the franchise. I'm not crazy about this artwork. It doesn't really do anything particularly new or cool, it's just another box art featuring several of the racing machines, though I do like how the side of the Hot Violet machine is going over the Game Boy Advance border. I always liked when games did this. It just gives the artwork a bit more three-dimensionality. The Japanese version of the box art is quite a bit different. Instead of featuring a racing scene, it's just a picture of Hot Violet on top of a space background. This artwork is somehow less interesting than the already pretty basic American artwork. Even the title of the game is more basic in Japan. In Japan, F-Zero Maximum Velocity is just called F-Zero for Game Boy Advance. A game franchise with a more drastic name change is Resident Evil, which started as a survival horror shooter released in 1996 for the PlayStation, where you play as either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, two members of a special forces squad called STARS, who've been trapped inside of a zombie-infested mansion while looking for their missing comrades. When the game was originally released in Japan, the game wasn't even called Resident Evil, it was called Biohazard. The box art for the Japanese version is pretty simple. It's the title of the game with an eye in the background. The red Z in the title is dripping, looking like blood. It's a fine box art. When the game was released in the West, the box art was changed to this. Technically, this isn't how the box art originally looked because early PS1 games actually came in these long boxes before eventually they started being released in the familiar jewel cases. But the artwork is the same. You've got Chris over here tweaking with a shotgun in his hand, and surrounding him are spiders and crows. You can't really see the crows in the jewel case version, and you can't really see them in the long box version either because the logo is in the way. You can see the crows pretty well in the European version of the Sega Saturn release of the game though. The Japanese Sega Saturn cover art removed the eye and the dripping Z in the game's logo. Instead, they've got what looks like an old rusty chain in the background. While I'm not a huge fan of the original Japanese box art, I don't think this is an improvement. The North American Sega Saturn box art has an image of a zombie looking back at you. Another one that's simple, but I think it's effective. Resident Evil 1 had several updated versions. If you want to learn more about all of the versions of Resident Evil 1, check out the video that's linked in the card at the top of the screen. But before you do that, let's talk about another game franchise with a lot of differences in the different regional box arts. That franchise is Naruto Ultimate Ninja, a series of fighting games that started in 2003 based on the popular battle manga Naruto, a story about an orphan boy who desperately wants to be the most powerful ninja in his village. Naruto ran in the weekly Shonen Jump magazine from 1999 to 2014. The Ultimate Ninja series began on the PS2 and, yeah, the game's box art is honestly just basically the same across Europe, Japan, and America. It's a nice box art, all things considered. You've got just about all of the game's major characters on there, with Naruto and his two other teammates, Sasuke and Sakura, taking up most of the space on the box here. There isn't much to talk about here, but I do like the smoky effect that's going on, which is a common thing that the actual manga and anime use. Like I said before, the box art is basically the same across multiple regions, with the only significant difference being that in the Japanese version, the game's logo is at the bottom and the characters are above it compared to in the American and European box arts, but no worries though, things get a lot more interesting with Ultimate Ninja 2, released in 2004, also on the PS2. The American release has Naruto throwing a shuriken with several of the game's other major characters all in the background. I do like how all of the characters are aligned in this sort of curving spiral pattern. It's visually cool and it makes sense if you're familiar with Naruto itself, as spirals are a pretty important concept to the series. In fact, Naruto's last name, Uzumaki, can be translated as spiral in English. The European release of the game is very similar to the American release, using the same artwork of the characters, but they arranged them in different spots, and they opted not to use the yellowish filter that they had over the characters in the American release. This version has a lot more color variety, but I also think it's more cluttered and busy than the American version. The Japanese version has a completely different box art, with an image of a pretty angry looking Naruto on the right side of the box, and all the other characters are on the left. Man, Naruto looks pissed here, but all in all, it's solid. I love the harsh diagonal shading lines here, which makes Naruto look way more menacing. Honestly, I think all of the box arts look pretty good. Next up, we have Naruto Ultimate Ninja 3, released on the PS2 in 2005. The artwork for Ultimate Ninja 3 is practically the same in the American and PAL versions. It's Naruto standing next to his rival Sasuke with the hero characters in orange on the left and the villains in blue on the right. I actually really like this one. Orange and blue are opposite colors, so there's a really nice contrast there. This whole box art has a nice theme of opposition and duality. The Japanese cover art went in a different direction, again going for a more intense looking artwork. You've got Naruto with his nine-tailed fox aura and his signature Rasengan attack in hand and ready for action. Then in the back at the top of the box, you've got Sasuke's menacing eyes. One really neat thing that I like about the Naruto Ultimate Ninja series is that the game's logo changes with each iteration, similar to the Final Fantasy series. The core logo is kept the same, but each new game will add a different spin on it. Like in the first game, the logo has an image of Naruto standing with a scroll. In the second game, the logo has an image of Naruto doing a Rasengan, and in the Japanese version of the third game, the logo has an image of Naruto doing his Rasengan with his Nine-Tails Fox power. It's a nice little bit of added flavor that gives each iteration in the series its own identity. One of the most signature parts of Capcom's identity is making tons of re-releases of the same games. In 1997, Capcom released the Resident Evil Director's Cut. They got rid of all of the extra stuff like the spiders and crows and just made the box art that goofy yet horrifying picture of Chris from the first game's box art. I personally prefer the original box art because that one really emphasized that you were trapped in a dangerous place filled with monsters, which fits the claustrophobic survival horror theme of the game. The Japanese version of the Director's Cut is also very simple, just a white background with the game's logo and a small picture of the zombie from the North American Sega Saturn version, just with a different color scheme. Like with the American Director's Cut, I'm not the biggest fan of this artwork. There was another updated version of the game released in 1998 called Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock version. The American version of this one swaps the image of Chris for an image of the Sega Saturn cover zombie. Again, I don't really care for this one. The Japanese version of the game went for something pretty different. Instead of zombies or crows or Chris losing his mind, the artwork is just the inside of the mansion. I actually quite like this cover. The artwork is from the perspective of someone walking inside the mansion from the front, and with the red carpet pulled out, it almost looks like the game is inviting you in to play it. Another game that's pretty inviting is the 2005 Nintendo DS game Animal Crossing Wild World. As the name would imply, in this box art you can see the planet of the game from a distance. There's several different villagers, shops, and other items of interest, like flowers, apples, and a present attached to a balloon. This box art does such a great job of portraying the wonder of playing an Animal Crossing game, getting to experience this world filled with cool characters and packed with all sorts of fun activities to take part in. The box art even references the game's day and night system with a bright daytime sky at the top of the box art that gradually shifts to an evening orange glow, until eventually we get to the bottom of the box art where you can see constellations in the night sky. This is a box art for the North American version, but the box art is practically the same thing in the European version. But one interesting thing about the European version is that the game got re-rated by PEGI, which is the age rating system used for video games in a lot of European countries. Animal Crossing Wild World's rating got changed from a PEGI 3 rating to a PEGI 7 rating, and because of that, the game technically has different box arts for each of the ratings. The Japanese box art of Wild World has basically the same artwork as the American and European versions, but the difference being the bottom half of the planet is shifted to the top of the box art, and the top half of the planet is on the bottom, so it almost looks like there's two planets in the box art. I prefer the American and European versions just because you get to see a full continuous image of the planet proper. The next game in the series was Animal Crossing City Folk, released in 2008 on the Nintendo Wii. Unfortunately, City Folk doesn't have any significant changes in its box art across the different regions. However, one really strange difference is that in the North American and European box arts, this girl villager has these bluish gray eyes, but in the Japanese box art, her eyes are black like the boy villager's eyes. A super oddly specific change, but whatever. Let's move on to the next game in the series, Animal Crossing New Leaf, released in 2012 on the Nintendo 3DS. The artwork across all regions is roughly the same. A nice picture of villagers all just kinda hanging out. New characters like your assistant Isabel and the retail shop owners Reese and Cyrus are shown off prominently in the foreground. Nothing to really say here other than it's really charming. The Japanese and Korean versions of the box art do have a small but notable difference in that they have a picture of a fence at the bottom of the box art with the game's logo in front of it. As a trade-off, you don't get to see as much of the sky compared to the box art in the other regions. Because of this, I prefer the box art in the other regions, plus I don't really think the fence adds much. While we're looking at handheld games, let's look at Naruto Ultimate Ninja Heroes, released in 2007 on the PSP. This release was actually a Western exclusive, so while North America and PAL regions got this game, Japan did not. This box art is fine. I don't have any issues with it, but it doesn't do anything particularly exciting either. I guess Sasuke's in his black Chunin exams outfit, which is pretty cool, but besides that, there's not much to talk about here. Let's move on to Ultimate Ninja Heroes 2, The Phantom Fortress, released in 2006. You're probably wondering, wait, if Ultimate Ninja Heroes 1 was released in 2007, how did Ultimate Ninja Heroes 2 come out a year earlier? Well, it's weird. In Japan, Naruto Ultimate Ninja Heroes 2 is called Naruto Narutimate Portable Mugenjo no Maki, and it came out in 2006. They decided to release an altered cut-down version of the game exclusively in the West, which was called Naruto Ultimate Ninja Heroes. But then later on, they just decided to release the uncut version of Narutimate Portable as Naruto Ultimate Ninja Heroes 2. But anyways, back to the box art. The box art for Naruto Ultimate Ninja Heroes 2 is practically the same in North America, PAL regions, and Japan, with the only notable difference being in Japan, the placements of some things are shifted around, like the logo is at the bottom and the castle is in the top right instead of the top left. The artwork itself is pretty cool. Naruto's doing his Rasengan at you, you've got a mysterious looking masked woman, and the castle looming in the background. My only complaint is that in the American and European versions, they just have the game's subtitle plopped into the bottom right there. It feels like they couldn't find anywhere else to put it, or they just forgot to put it in there, so they just threw it on the bottom. The PlayStation Portable is cool, but let's go back to the original PlayStation with Resident Evil 2, released in 1998. Instead of being trapped in a mansion, you're trapped in Raccoon City, where you play as a rookie cop, Leon S. Kennedy, and a college student, Claire Redfield. The American box art is another image of a zombie, but this time it's threateningly leering at you from behind a corner. The European and Japanese versions also have an image of a zombie on their box art, but this picture is rendered in black and white. Personally, I prefer the American version because the zombie peeking around a corner is just more creepy to me. Like the first Resident Evil 2 would also get a DualShock version. The American version has the same artwork as the base release, but the Japanese artwork is completely different. It's an image of the two playable characters standing side by side with their guns at the ready. The 3D models are obviously a bit dated, but I do think it looks cool. At the very least, I think Leon's bright blue uniform and Claire's pink outfit add some eye-catching 90s color to the usually pretty dark and dreary Resident Evil box arts, kind of like the box art for the next game in the series, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, released in 1999, where you play as Jill again as she escapes from the overrun Raccoon City, seen in Resident Evil 2. The American box art is gnarly. You've got the game's titular enemy, the Nemesis, front and center with his huge teeth and visible gums. Also, I like how the logo of the game is framed on the chest of the Nemesis. Speaking of the logo, the Resident Evil logo is a bit different from before. The V in the logo is a bit larger and the whole logo looks like it's breaking. The European box art is similar to the North American one, but the Resident Evil logo is the same, and instead of a really close-up shot of Nemesis, the camera is pulled back a bit so we can see more of Nemesis. The Japanese version, titled Biohazard 3 Last Escape, pulls the camera back even more so we can get a nearly full body shot of Nemesis. Nemesis also seems to be holding an unfortunate STARS member by their head. My personal favorite is the American version. I love how Nemesis is right there in your face, and most of his body being covered in darkness just adds to that menacing aura. Let's move away from the zombies with the insane speed of F-Zero GX, which was released in 2003 on the GameCube. The placements of some of the elements on the box art are different in the Japanese version compared to the American and European versions. Like, for example, the logo in the Japanese version is in the middle of the box art. But besides that, it's almost the same thing. Unfortunately, it's kind of the same deal with the next game in the series, F-Zero GP Legend, released in 2004 for the Game Boy Advance. This game is based on the F-Zero GP Legend anime that started in 2003. The only really noticeable difference between the American and Japanese box arts is Lisa Brilliant is shown on the left of the box art in the Japanese version, along with Samurai Goro, Jody, and Rick Wheeler. It could be that they left her off of the American version because the North American GBA box arts have less horizontal space. The European version of GP Legend has a completely different box art though. It isn't anything too interesting though, just a bunch of the machines in a race again. The next game in the series was F-Zero Climax, released in 2004 on the Game Boy Advance, and like the last game, it takes elements from the F-Zero anime. This game was a Japan exclusive, so there's no changes across different regions to talk about. The box art itself is fine though. Speaking of anime, let's get back to Naruto with Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm, released in 2008 on the PlayStation 3. Storm would finally take the Ultimate Ninja series to full 3D gameplay. The North American box art has side-by-side close-ups of Naruto and Sasuke. I like it, but I think the Japanese cover is better. Like the American box art, it's images of Naruto and Sasuke, but the artwork here has so much more detail. You can even see many of the strands of Naruto's hair. The shading and highlighting here are great. I also just like the more low-key vibe that this artwork went for. The box arts for all of these games are usually really in-your-face and action-packed, and that works, don't get me wrong, but there's a sort of calm intensity that emanates from this artwork. Naruto and Sasuke don't look angry so much as they look determined, like they're staring down each other right before they start trading blows. Next up we have Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja 4. This game is the first Ultimate Ninja game to be based on the second part of the manga/anime series, when a slightly older Naruto battles against the dangerous group of rogue ninjas known as the Akatsuki. This game came out in 2007, which of course was before 2008 when Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm released, but I wanted to wrap up all of the Ultimate Ninja games based on part 1 of the manga first. Anyways, the American box art of Ultimate Ninja 4 is solid, but I don't think it's as interesting as some of the earlier box arts. It's just Naruto with a kunai in his mouth and several Akatsuki members on the side. I don't think the Japanese box art is incredibly impressive either. Naruto's got his left fist in his right hand as he stands in the middle of the box art, with the various other characters on either side of him. To be fair, there's nothing wrong with this box art or the American one, they're both just decent. Though I do prefer the American one only because I think Naruto's pose is a little bit livelier here. Next up we have Ultimate Ninja 5. A game that interestingly didn't get an American release, so we'll just be taking a look at the European and Japanese box arts. One thing I should note is that the Japanese version of Ultimate Ninja 4 is called Naruto Shippuden Narutimate Excel, and Ultimate Ninja 5 is called Excel 2, which is why you see a big 2 on the Japanese box art for this game instead of a 5. Anyway, the European and Japanese box arts are essentially the same thing. Naruto and Sasuke doing cool poses with a bunch of other characters in the background. Pretty standard stuff. Next up is Ultimate Ninja Heroes 3, which is called Narutimate Excel 3 in Japan. The box art is about the same across all regions, so nothing much to talk about here. Continuing on, we move back to the Storm subseries with Ultimate Ninja Storm 2, which sadly is basically the same across all regions. Next up, we have another PSP game, Ultimate Ninja Impact. The European and American box arts are just about the same, but the Japanese version actually has a lot more characters on the cover located on the bottom half of the box art. On the right you have the heroes, and on the left you have the villains. I mean, it works. Not much to say here. Moving right along, our next game is Ultimate Ninja Storm Generations. The gimmick of this game was that it brought back the younger versions of several of the characters from earlier in part 1 of the series. This is the point in the franchise when the box arts for the Ultimate Ninja games basically became uniform across Japan, PAL regions, and North America. So while anticlimactic, this is where we end off the Naruto Ultimate Ninja series. Let's end off another series by taking a look at the last few Animal Crossing games. Animal Crossing New Leaf got a major update a few years later in 2016 called the Welcome Amiibo update. This update added several new things like brand new villagers, new furniture items, and most notably support for Nintendo's Toys to Life products, Amiibo. New Leaf got new box art to go with the new update. The new box art is very similar to the old one, but only on the right side of the artwork. The left side is completely different. Instead of Reese and Cyrus, you've got Gulliver in a van. Instead of holding a chair, the girl villager is sitting on a stump by a fire. I think I prefer the Welcome Amiibo box art because Gulliver's van looks sweet. Animal Crossing would get a spin-off called Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer on the 3DS in 2015, which was less about living your life in a town filled with cute animals and more about being a decorator for a bunch of houses. Unfortunately, this game's box art is pretty much the same across all regions. 2015 was the year of Animal Crossing spin-offs because, along with Happy Home Designer, that year also gave us Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival on the Wii U, a party board game reminiscent of the Mario Party series. Sadly, this box art is pretty much the same across Japan, Europe, and North America. Finally, with the most recent major game in the series, we have Animal Crossing New Horizons, released in 2020 on the Nintendo Switch. The box art is pretty reminiscent of the New Leaf box art. It features many of the game's characters just kinda hanging out. 2 human villagers are making stuff with the game's new crafting system. Timmy and Tommy are with their Uncle Tom Nook, Rod is getting some sun on the beach, all around it's just good vibes. The box art is nice, but unfortunately the box art in every region is just about the same. Let's wrap things up with a few more of the Resident Evil games, like Resident Evil Code Veronica, released on the Sega Dreamcast in the year 2000, where you once again play as Claire Redfield, who goes to a research lab in Paris to search for her missing brother Chris. The American box art is pretty simple, just 3D models of Claire and Chris in front of a spooky nighttime background. The Japanese box art is similar, but Claire and Chris are posed differently, and you get a better look at the mansion that's featured in the game. Both box arts are fine, but I don't particularly care for either of them. An updated version of Code Veronica titled Resident Evil Code Veronica X was released on the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 a year later in 2001, though the Dreamcast version was a Japan exclusive. The Dreamcast box art for Code Veronica X, which is called Biohazard Code Veronica Kazanban, is pretty disappointing, just the game's logo on top of a white map. From what I can tell, there were multiple versions of the Japanese PlayStation 2 box art. You've got this version, which is essentially just the Dreamcast version, but you get to see more of the map. Then you've also got this version, which looks like the Japanese Dreamcast box art of the base version of Code Veronica, but the castle in the background is clouded in this white fog. The American Code Veronica X box art is basically just the original version with a few changes, most notably a faint image of a, certain sunglasses wearing Matrix guy behind Chris and Claire. I haven't talked about the European box arts of the Code Veronica game simply because they're mostly the same as the box arts in other regions, but I do want to look at the European version of Code Veronica X because man is it something. It's a super close-up shot of Claire's face. I really don't know why they did this, but at least one cool thing is you can see a zombie in the reflection of Claire's eyes. Continuing on, we have the remake of the original Resident Evil, released in 2002 on the GameCube. Fortunately, we have another instance where the box art is quite a bit different across the different regions. The Japanese box art is actually a remake of the Japanese box art of Resident Evil 1 Director's Cut DualShock version, which is pretty cool. On one hand, it is a little disappointing that they didn't do something new, but on the other hand, the Japanese box art of Resident Evil 1 Director's Cut DualShock version was my favorite of the Japanese box arts for RE1, so I can't really complain much. The European box art is honestly incredibly bland. It's unironically just the game's title on a black background. I know there's some red marks that look like blood here and there, but man, this is kinda sad. Fortunately, the American artwork is pretty good. It's Jill in a close quarters fight with a zombie. It's a tense action scene, and I love the ominous light coming in from the window. This is definitely my favorite of the Resident Evil Remake box art versions. Finally, we'll end this video ironically enough by looking at Resident Evil 0, released in 2002 on the GameCube. Resident Evil 0 is a prequel to the first Resident Evil where STARS operative Rebecca Chambers and convict Billy Cohen have to work together to survive another zombie-filled nightmare. The Japanese box art is fairly straightforward. Rebecca and Billy in a trashed room standing side by side with their guns drawn. Pretty standard Resident Evil stuff. The North American version opted to pull the camera in a bit closer to the two characters, but with the downside being that the perspective of the whole thing looks a bit off now because it looks like Rebecca and Billy are really short since the table and everything else in the room looks taller than them. The European version opted to do something similar to the European version of the remake of Resident Evil 1. Instead of Rebecca and Billy standing together, it's the game's logo in front of a white background with what looks like bacteria under a microscope. I mean, it definitely fits the series considering the franchise is all about viral outbreaks, but even so, just like the European version of the Resident Evil 1 remake box art, I do think this one is a tad plain. If you're looking for more videos about game box art differences, I have a playlist of similar videos to this one that you can check out. Here's another video that you might enjoy as well. That's all I've got to talk about for today though, so thanks for watching y'all, and have a great rest of your day.